Well, today we had a great piece of scripture. I just listened to those words and I think, man, Paul really nailed it in those verses today about the heart of how we're trying to shape people to become more Christ-like. And was there anything in the scripture reading that caught your attention today? Anything that sounded familiar for anyone? Romans 12. It's part of it is the closing commissioning after communion. We pull part of that out of there, and I'm going to show you a couple of pieces of scripture here that I think are particularly important. Verses 1 and 2, and what I want to talk about especially today is verse 1. I appeal to you, therefore, my friends, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. We'll talk about that a little bit. But also, verse 2 was a passage that some of our youth chose on our mission trip. And those of you who were here a few weeks ago when they had their review of the trip, they actually formed a devotion about this, talking about how easy it is to go along with the way things are and how important it is for us to be different and to transform ourselves. It's a famous passage. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Does anybody know what that is? Monarch, butterfly, chrysalis. All right. Many churches have butterflies in their stained glass windows. It's been a symbol for a long time. It's about the struggle for spiritual growth. And I understand that the monarch butterfly is endangered now because of some of the habitats that have been destroyed and the migration patterns that come up, which is something else that we need to deal with, a very important situation, how difficult it is for them and how fragile their lives are. But if someone would take a knife and cut open the chrysalis to make it easier for the butterfly would die. And it wouldn't form into what it is today. It's necessary. Matter of fact, it's a normal part of their development to struggle. If you've ever seen a chrysalis moving around and they're trying to beat their wings against the outside of their container, that's necessary for them to develop their muscles. It's necessary for them to develop into the butterfly that they're to become. They have to struggle. And so, throughout the centuries, it's become a symbol of spiritual growth. Because it's never easy. We can never enter into faith in a disinterested way. Because in order for us to really grow, of necessity, we really have to struggle. There's in Gestalt therapy, there's a line that I like. It's called, the fundamental question of life is whether we live life from the outside in or from the inside out. In other words, if we live our lives according to the things that go on around us, or if there's something inside of us calling us to grow and to be our own person. And so the question that Paul would have today from our passage is your faith shaking up the world, or is the world shaking up your faith? That's an important question to think about. Are we living outside in? Or are we living inside out? Faith is inside. It's in our heart. It's the inclinations, it's the intentions that we make to do good things. Our passage today, it might be the only reference to a living sacrifice in the entire Bible. And the early church, I want to remind you, grew because people saw people of faith making sacrifices. And that's the way the early church grew. It wasn't because they saw a comfortable life or something good in a worldly way, but because they saw that people really believed in these things. In fact, they believed in them enough to change their lives and to struggle. And I think that when Paul said, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, that in his age he meant that. He meant that there are times you're going to have to stand up against the way things are in order to do the right thing. Have you ever noticed how people become animated when they're talking about something that really matters to them? It's at the center of who they are. And sometimes we might not think about faith as being a form of reckless abandon. We might think more of faith as being something that keeps us safe or keeps us from doing things that are harmful to ourselves. But Paul had this idea of faith that it's all out. You're either all in or you're all out. My son was back from China a few weeks ago, and he was joking about how many people in China wear English phrases that they don't even know what it means. And it's true. You'll see people all over China, and it's just cool to wear a shirt that has some kind of English letters on it. And it could say any silly thing, and they probably don't know what it is. In fact, he's told some of his students that they shouldn't wear that shirt because it says some things that are objectionable. They don't know. They just wear it because it's cool. There's a website that has epic tattoo fails. You know what that is? Like people that get a Chinese character tattooed on their body. They really probably don't know what it really means. Some of those things are the Emperor's Clerk, mad diarrhea, rice fried by pork fat, sesame chicken, and gold pig, among others that I couldn't list today in this sanctuary. How easily we conform to things that we think are cool. When you're out and around, look at how many people have Chinese letters. I wonder if they really know what it means, or if it's off a menu somewhere. The United Church of Christ has one of their major emphases now as transforming lives, and it comes from this passage today. And I want to tell you the story about a Bedouin. He was caught in a sandstorm. He had a candle, and he had a bag of dates. He pulled out the first date, and he saw it was full of worms. And so he threw it out the tent flag. He picked up a second date, full of worms. He threw it out the tent flag. He picked up the third date, and he held it up to the candle, and he looked at it, and there were more worms. So he blew out the candle and ate the rest of the dates. And that's the way it goes with our lives. A bad thing happens, a bad thing happens, a bad thing happens, we think life's a bad thing. But we don't change from the inside out. We don't go try to fix our situation. Elie Wiesel, the great Holocaust survivor, said the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. It's not doing the things that we know need to be done to make a difference in the world. This past week, I appreciated the opportunity to be on vacation, and Ellen and I went to a place we've always wanted to go in Cincinnati. It's called the Freedom Museum. And if any of you have been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., the Freedom Museum is very similar. I encourage you to go down there. It's a story of the Underground Railroad, and it's a story of freedom for people in all sorts of places. And you go through a place like that, and you go through the Holocaust Museum, and you just wonder, how could people be so conformed by their culture or by their nationalism to allow things like that to continue on and not see what was happening to the people that suffered because of that lifestyle? How could we have allowed slavery to exist in the form it existed in for so long? How in the world could we have seen the atrocities of World War II? How can today in the world those kinds of things still be going on? Are we conformed to this world and the opinions of this world? Or do we look into these things? Do we talk to people? Do we consider and be mindful of how it affects everyone? Paul wants us to consider in this passage why people become indifferent. And he reminds us that there is no hero in the Bible who ever received a blessing without struggling against the way things are. And there is no hero in the Bible that ever performed God's will by playing it safe. I always try to get at this in different ways. I say you have to have an investment in the work of the church. Or you have to have ownership in the work of the church. Well, Paul said it today, you have to be a living sacrifice. And the things that you put yourself on the line for are the things that you most believe in your deepest heart. Now, Paul calls this sacrifice a reasonable service. And the Greek word for service is the word for worship. So it's our form of worship to go out into the world as transformed people and to do God's will and to be sure that God's will is done. We were at a church workshop last Saturday. 6 of us from Trinity went there. We have a lot of stuff, a lot of information to bring back to you from that workshop. But one thing that they said was very interesting was the largest growing denomination in the United States today is spiritual but not religious. In other words, there's all these people that believe they don't have to be connected to anybody else who's a Christian in the life of the church. They don't need the church to be spiritual. And so they polled those people because those are the people who are not here. Those are the people whose opinion matter because those are the people who really need to see that the church is a connection. It's a grounding for people. And so these are the 4 things that they discovered after poll. They put a couple polls together and they came up with this. Number 1, the image of the church that hurts us most is that people in the church are hypocritical. That they won't really welcome me if I go. So the number 1 thing that people said about what they're looking for in church is someone who accepts you for you, no matter where you come from, what you wear, or what you look like. You can see that, right? We all want grace. We all need to be accepted. Number 2, active in helping people in the community who are hurting and in need. Number 3, people care deeply for and support each other. And number 4, they believe that God's love is available to all people, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation. Very interesting. I've heard these things and say, that's Trinity. People are looking for us. These are the things that we do. These are the things that we have to lift up. And those words are reflected in the 12th chapter of Romans, right? A church that connects people. A church that's connected to the community. A church that makes a difference. A church that accepts people as they are. That's what people yearn for. I also found this. That is terrible. This was discouraging for me. But I saw it and I thought, you know what? This is the opposite of what Paul is saying. And this is the attitude that many people adopt in the world today. This is advice from a prisoner that came out of a magazine for community reentry, working a lot on community reentry now. People coming out of prisons. Think about the things that are the ethics of being in prison. Keep your eyes closed. Don't see anything. Keep your mouth shut. Don't talk to anyone. Don't make a best friend. Don't consider anyone your friend. You went in alone. You're leaving alone. You can see how that ethic would almost be necessary. We're talking about outside in, inside out. But this is the way many people live their lives. They live their lives being afraid to have connection with people because they've learned that they can't trust. In 2 Peter, it says, Paul's letters contain things in them that are hard to understand. don't know. I don't think this is hard to understand. I really don't. I don't think the gospel is that hard. I don't think faith is that hard. This is it. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. You can pick any verse out of the ones that we have, but I want you to see the sharp contrast between the world's attitude and Paul's attitude. And Paul lived in a time of Roman domination. So it's probably true that that kind of an idea was also prominent. And this is what Paul's reacting against. Paul has this attitude, pro ego esme, which basically means give thought to others before yourselves. Literally, the word pro means before. The word ego means, what do you think? Self. Means ego. Yeah. Before your own ego, esme, place others. Before your own ego, place others. Is what he says, literally. I heard someone talking on the radio, and he said a good way to understand the word ego is edging God out. Ego. I read a commentary on this piece of scripture, and they were referring to this phrase of Paul, and they said, this is the attitude taught by Jesus and sporadically practiced by Christians. See the list that we got from the Church of God's People? Sporadically practiced by Christians. Love must be genuine. And in the early church, they knew that something had changed because people associated beyond their class. This was the thing that people noticed about them, was that they no longer had the Greek or the Roman attitude that you only try to associate with people who can help you, that you can benefit from. So we have prison ethics and we have Christian ethics. And we have to ask ourselves, what world do we want to live in? The world of fear, the world of faith? The world of love, or the world of distrust? The world of isolation, or the world of connection? There's a question in our Sunday school curriculum, if you could change one thing in the world, what would it be? If that's the thing that makes you come alive, think about that and go do it. We need to move away in our society. Terrible things happening here in America. And we have to move away from our love of violence and toward a love of civility. And somehow we have to realize our connection to all things. And worship is unity. We have this experience where we realize how we're connected to other people. And someone asked, well, what do we want to happen? What do we want to have happen? And I say, well, we can have everybody Google the quotes of Martin Luther King. We can have somebody read the Gospels. We can have somebody make a lifelong connection to other people and follow Paul's advice, pro ego esme. So I got my Hall of Fame here today. Martin Luther King, we're working on this because this is the theme of the essays that children are writing in public schools. In preparation for Martin Luther King, last year we had over 400 students in the public schools write essays about Martin Luther King. And this year, this is the quote that we gave them. Life's most persistent, urgent question is, what are you doing for others? You can see how he was influenced by Paul. Back to Plato, the price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. Indifference has been a theme throughout the years. Albert Einstein, the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. And finally, this is for all my baseball fans out there. Does anybody know who this is? Hall of Fame time. He's not a Hall of Famer.
Coco.
He used to play for the Indians. He's now playing for the Oakland Athletics. Except he's hurt. Coco Crisp. Right. Remember Coco Crisp? He used to like Coco Crisp. You know what I liked about him? He'd run through the wall and catch the ball. You know. Matter of fact, he did the other day. He sprained his neck. Well, look at all the extreme sports in our world today. Look at how many are really into something when they're really sacrificed for it. And how the more they sacrifice for it, the more they're into it. Coco Crisp had hustle. He was in the Hall of Fame because he was mindful while he was there. Are we conformed to fear or transformed to love? Jesus told a story one time about a bunch of indifferent people who walked by a guy by the side of the road. It's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now I can just imagine the guy in front, the guy in the back, they're saying that same thing. Don't make eye contact, don't make eye contact, don't look, don't listen. Don't talk about these things, don't tell anybody about what you've seen. I don't want to be responsible. I didn't see anything. And there was one guy who lived from the inside out. There was one guy who didn't ignore the man by the side of the road. He was lifted up by Jesus as an example of a good neighbor. So often in Scripture, it'll say Jesus looked at him, or Jesus looked at her, because Jesus was able to see people, and he didn't go away from it. By the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about my friend who had challenged me to join him in trying to summarize sermons with 1 minute. Remember? Somebody said it was like 61 seconds, but I think they probably edited it wrong. But anyway, it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube. So here's the 1 minute summary of the sermon today. Most people are prisoners to fear. They live by prison rules. Don't look, don't question, go along. But our faith encourages us to make connections and to be liberated from our fears, to live transformed lives and move beyond the cynical, critical, indifferent, conventional wisdom of our time, which tells people only take care of yourself. So don't be indifferent, be different. Run through walls for what you know to be right. Doing God's will is our inspiration, and we've seen God's will in the way Jesus saw the world and treated people. Paul said, pro ego esme, outdo one another in showing respect, because this is your spiritual worship.